Perfect. So I'm going to first introduce Dr. Tonge. Is that the right pronunciation, Tonge?
That's correct, yeah.
Yeah, Dr. Tonge, who will then give his presentation, and then I'll present Bairbre, Dr. Chiosáin. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that even correctly right. And then I will let you give your presentation afterwards, and then we'll have a sort of discussion sort of at the end, once we've had both presentations. So Dr. Tonge is a professor of politics at the University of Liverpool. He is the author or co-author of a dozen books on Northern Irish politics, including the Democratic Unionist Party from Protest to Power, the Ulster Unionist Party, Country Before Party, Sinn Féin, and the SDLP, from Alienation to Participation, and the New Northern Irish Politics. The next book will be a membership survey of the Alliance Party, due to be published by Oxford University Press later this year. Professor Tonge has been the director of the last 4 Economic and Social Research Council Northern Ireland General Election Surveys. I think that was everything. Now, let one last person in, and then I will give you the rights to present, and then it's all yours.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Thanks ever so much for the invitation. I'll speak for about 20-25 minutes under the title, and I'll just go to the share screen now. Call up. Hope everyone can see that. If anyone can't see it, then do let me know. Can Northern Ireland ever be a stable democracy? At the risk of spoiling the ending slightly, the answer is probably no, if that helps. But we've got 20-25 minutes to discuss why it's probably a no. And in talking about Northern Ireland's instability, it's worth saying, you know, the instability in Northern Ireland is chronic politically, but it's not in some ways untypical. I probably don't need to tell this audience of consociational setups across the globe. You think Lebanon, Bosnia, even Belgium, you know, struggling to form governments at times, and Northern Ireland is perhaps an acute case, but it's not an exceptional case in some other respects. If we look more broadly, though, I mean, let's start on an optimistic note, because peace processes throughout the globe have 3 core elements. One is security, stopping violence. The second is state building or creating better forms of governance. And the third is achieving justice. And achieving justice has been particularly fraught in Northern Ireland, but it tends to be fraught globally. So we've got to be careful about making Northern Ireland a sort of area of exceptionalism. The big success story of the Good Friday Agreement, and the reason why that 1998 peace deal is lauded globally, is because it has been such a resounding success on the security front. If we deal with that, these figures might look discouraging, but compared to, you know, thousands of deaths, 3,600, 3,700, depending which figures you use, deaths, more than 45,000 people maimed, seriously injured or maimed during the conflict. These figures, they represent low-level violence, and all peace processes, again, globally, have spoiler elements. You look at the work of people like Stedman. It's actually been a remarkable success, the Good Friday Agreement, in reducing violence. And again, you know, there are caveats to that. The worst atrocity of the entire conflict came after the Good Friday Agreement, Omagh, which the UK government announced a public inquiry into only yesterday. So there is low-level residual violence. A lot of that is actually continuing battles by paramilitary groups for control of their communities. Quite a lot that accounts for quite a lot of the shootings, the bombing incidents. Again, mainly low level. If you can have such, it's not an oxymoron. I'm talking about a low level bombing incident. Quite a large number of arrests and a great deal of infiltration from those renegades, ultras, spoilers, call them what you will, who want to carry on the fight. But basically, the fight has been transferred into a set of political institutions. The problem is the political institutions have often not been functioning within Northern Ireland. In terms of justice, the blunt truth is, and this again is not uncommon in peace processes, is that there isn't really justice for a large number or the vast bulk of the families of the victims. And the British government is in effect about to give up on justice, really, because there's currently a bill going through the House of Lords at Westminster, nearly completed its legislative passage, which has done the remarkable feat of uniting Northern Ireland, because all the parties are opposed to this. The Irish government is opposed to this, but it's basically that the British government is giving up on prosecutions in favour of truth telling. So as long as you tell the truth, you will not be liable to prosecution if you're suspected of having been involved in the killings. And more than 90% of those killings remain unsolved. So security good, justice not good. And now, what about the sort of main menu for this morning? What about governance in Northern Ireland? Has there been a transition to a stable democracy out of conflict or not? Well, the Good Friday Agreement set up 3 strands of state-building institutions. The strand 3 was a London-Dublin axis, a British-Irish intergovernmental conference, another apparatus. Strand 2 was the all-Ireland dimension, north-south bodies straddling the island of Ireland. But the main feature really was power sharing within Northern Ireland, strand 1, power sharing executive and assembly. That really has been the most important, but also by far the most problematic aspect of that 1998 deal. Why? Well, it's classic consociationism in a lot of ways, although it's a liberal consociational deal in the sense that there's not fixed places for unionists and a fixed number of places for nationalists within the assembly, and other parties like the Alliance Party, more of which later in the centre ground can be elected in unlimited numbers. The fact is that it's still set up on a binary basis, a unionist nationalist deal really. And it's a liberal consociation, but it's got the illiberal elements of consociationism as well. It's very binary, it's top down, and you can argue that the mutual vetoes that were built in to the arrangements in 1998 were just as strong as any pushes towards joined up government, and that's been a recurring problem. It also, again, classic consociationism, it doesn't reconcile Northern Irish society, it manages divisions with all the strengths and weaknesses. You could certainly argue, and most people would argue, and I'd be in that company, that the Good Friday Agreement was certainly the best deal that could have been found in 1998, when you had, the ending of a grisly ethno-national conflict. You can argue for much more integrated solutions now, but 1998, that simply wasn't possible. So the issue is that the setup in 1998 has not really been revised or reformed to a major extent since. So we've had government, but not as you know it, and often non-government. Look at the number of executive collapses that you see in front of you. The executive has been down, the Northern Ireland so-called governing executive has been down for 40% of the time since the institutions were created. Not a happy record. The Northern Ireland devolved power sharing executive, it's fallen miles behind the other devolved institutions in the UK. The Scottish Parliament is arguably the most powerful devolved parliament anywhere in Europe. Wales has gone from a Mickey Mouse tin pot county council devolved arrangement in the late 1990s to becoming a fully blown parliament, a Welsh Senate. And Northern Ireland has had one big success in terms of the transfer of power. That was policing and justice in 2010. That was a big win, given that hundreds of police officers have been killed during the conflict. But it's not a happy record. And of course, we had an election to the Northern Ireland Assembly last year, but that's never even got off the ground. The Assembly and the Executive haven't sat properly since that election last year. In a particular form of madness, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland then said, well, at one point, he's going to call another election, as if just calling elections will solve the basic political problem, which is that of a lack of joined-up government. In some ways, you could have expected teething problems when the devolved institutions were set up in 1999, a year after the Good Friday Agreement, for a society coming out of conflict. But I think the most dismal statistic is that power sharing has been interrupted more times in the last 5 years than it was in the first 5 years of power sharing. When you might have expected almost a quarter of a century on from the Good Friday Agreement for things to be stabilising, but it hasn't been the case, and Northern Ireland remains at the moment without a government, and all eyes are upon the EU and the UK government as to whether a protocol deal can be done to get the DUP, the largest unionist party, back into government. But this was an attempt to build power sharing across a chasm that remains. The Good Friday Agreement, again, classic consociationism, the essential constitutional divide and this essential consociation, essentializing identity. Well, you know, those differences remain. But these figures are just the start today as they were in 1998 in terms of differences, identity differences. So Catholics feeling either exclusively Irish or more Irish than British, and mainly exclusively Irish. Protestants not feeling Irish, Protestants feeling either exclusively British or more British than Irish. And so these divisions, if you track this, the annual Northern Ireland Life and Time survey, what you see basically is these figures largely unchanged from 1998. And you know, there's no common sense of Northern Irishness that has really developed, despite it being talked up by some optimistic commentators. And this is played out, you know, you can show a whole variety of slides on this. If you look at religion and ideological affiliation, you know, Protestants, 69% identifying as unionist, only 1% identifying as nationalist, Catholics identifying mainly as nationalist. You see there is a significant percentage of people, though, on the right-hand column there, who identify as neither unionist nor nationalist. And I think that's an interesting category, because there is a centre ground in Northern Ireland that, you know, a substantial body of people, as you see there, that don't play the binary game, but those people don't tend to vote. If you look at the votes cast at the most recent Northern Ireland Assembly election, 80% of them were cast for unionist or nationalist parties. Elections in Northern Ireland remain contests of the true believers, because a lot of those who say they're neither unionist nor nationalist are disaffected by the system, particularly young people, and therefore they stay away from the polls. And in some respects, Northern Ireland elections tend to exaggerate the polarity of Northern Ireland compared to the electorate as a whole. And then you've got party support by religion. This is fairly emphatic. Percentage of Protestants who say that they support either Sinn Féin or the SDLP, and only 2%. A percentage of Catholics saying that they support the unionist parties of either the Democratic Unionist Party or the Ulster Unionist Party, 2%, mirror image. It's the strongest correlation still by far between religion and voting anywhere in Europe. So you see there, again, these figures are not greatly unchanged. And then so you've got these big identity divisions which remain unhealed, and you can argue, well, healing isn't required as long as you're managing differences peacefully. You know, that's the best we can hope for. And then you've got the constitutional question. You know, how would you vote in a referendum tomorrow? Which in some ways is a silly question that's asked, because there isn't going to be a referendum on tomorrow on Northern Ireland's constitutional status. But the rules of the game, the rules of the Good Friday Agreement are that if it appears that there is a majority in favour of constitutional change, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland is legally obliged to call that referendum. We're not at that position yet. If you look at the opinion polls, support for the Northern Ireland staying in the UK is only around the 50% mark. It's far from a comfortable majority. It's barely a majority these days. But that doesn't mean to say that the other 50% want a united Ireland. It's about averaging around 37% for United Ireland, and about 12 to 13% don't know. So the United Ireland support camp would have to win over all the don't knows to even get the referendum on, and then they've got to actually win the border poll. There can be further referendums at a minimum gap of every 7 years after. So if you look though, I mean, what's stark about these figures are, you know, Catholics not wanting Northern Ireland to remain in the UK, Protestants wanting Northern Ireland to remain in the UK, surprising no one. Very few Protestant takers for United Ireland. 2/3 of Catholics say they would vote for a United Ireland. So again, pretty stark polarity on that. What you've seen really is, so the ethno-national game played out within the institutions, but you've seen significant change, going back to the point about it being a liberal, if it's not an oxymoron, a liberal consociation. Because if you look at those assembly seats, you've seen significant shift. You know, back in 1998, no one thought that Sinn Féin, a party which still won't even use the term Northern Ireland and instructs civil servants to remove the term Northern Ireland from documents, because it doesn't actually still formally recognise the existence of Northern Ireland. Sinn Féin, no one thought that Sinn Féin would become the largest party in the north back in 1998, but Sinn Féin now is the largest party within the assembly. Michelle O'Neill, the leader of Sinn Féin in the north, is First Minister-elect. She's waiting for the DUP leader, Geoffrey Donaldson, to join in political matrimony at the Stormont altar. The DUP, again, people thought that the DUP were finished by opposing the Good Friday Agreement in 1998, but they have been the largest unionist party for a long time now. But the big point here is that it's nationalists that now nationalists provide the largest party. That again reflects change in Northern Ireland, and it adds in some ways to the instability, because the unionist total vote, the unionist block vote, so add up the DUP vote, the UUP vote, TUV, the traditional unionist voice, which is a very hardline unionist party, it's down 10% from where it was at the time of the Good Friday Agreement. Demographic changes partly account for that, and there's partly some unionist votes have gone off to the centre ground and the Alliance Party. But that's not been replaced by an increase in the nationalist vote, which has been steady at 40%, the combined nationalist vote. But if you actually look at the votes cast, you've got these days, within Northern Ireland elections, it's around 40% for the unionists, 40% for the nationalists, and 20% for the others. So in voting terms, you could argue things are pretty close between those who would like a united Ireland and those who want Northern Ireland to stay in the UK. So change is there, and it further contributes, I think, to the instability. There's how Sinn Féin have eclipsed the SDLP. You've almost got sort of a reverse staircase effects there. The SDLP, the moderate nationalist party of John Hume, it was expected at the time of the Good Friday Agreement that they would dominate Northern Irish politics, along with, on the unionist side, the Ulster Unionist Party. But Sinn Féin, partly as a product of the IRA disappearing, but Sinn Féin was on the rise before then. Sinn Féin goes from strength to strength. So the sort of final section really is, well, okay, so that's the position. You've got you've got identity differences that show no sign of healing. You don't see, you've got constitutional instability by the fact that Northern Ireland's constitutional future remains uncertain. If you look at surveys of public opinion, when the public was asked, the Northern Irish public, will Northern Ireland still exist in 25 years? There wasn't a majority for that. And when the public was asked in Northern Ireland, do you think Northern Ireland will exist in 50 years? There were very few takers for that. Big differences between unionists and nationalists. Unionists still believed it would exist in 25 years, but only a minority of unionists believed that Northern Ireland would still exist in 50 years. So you can understand why Northern Ireland, in terms of the question today about a stable democracy, well, the very existence of Northern Ireland continues to be called into question. Things might have looked better for Northern Ireland if you'd had stable, devolved power sharing government. It was always a leap of faith to expect everyone to live happily ever after come the time of the Good Friday Agreement. There have been different reasons for the collapses in the political institutions. It's almost as if these have been parties looking for something to row about at times, because think of an issue and it can collapse the Northern Ireland executive. There's obviously the systemic issues, that the broader theoretical as well as empirical points about the issues with consociational government. Does it prioritize vetoes and community autonomy more than it prioritizes joined up integrated government? So there's the systemic issues. Then you've got the actual empirical issues, which have, and first they in the early years were perhaps predictably the legacy of conflict. The IRA did not decommission any weapons in advance of the Good Friday Agreement and refused to for a while afterwards. And so that early period of devolution, devolved power sharing, 1998 to 2005, was dogged by issues over the IRA going away. The IRA decommissioned and went away in 2005, although there are those splinter groups who like to lay claim to the title deeds of the IRA by trying to carry on some sort of violent campaign. Then you've got the cultural and social issues, and perhaps these need separating. The cultural issue really is about language. Sinn Féin was promised an Irish Language Act. Scotland and Wales have had language acts, and it was sort of forgotten about for many years. Sinn Féin walked out of the political institutions in 2017, and under the system, if the first or deputy first minister quits, then everything collapses. Okay, that's the current system of mandatory coalition. So the Deputy First Minister, the Nationalist First Minister at the time, Sinn Féin's Martin McGuinness, when he walked out, the First Minister, the Unionist, the DUP leader, Arlene Foster, she lost her job at the same time because of the mandatory coalition system. So Irish Language Act, and that was sort of totemic for Sinn Féin and collapsed the institutions for 3 years. You've also had the social issues where mainly, not exclusively, because there was some social conservatives within the SDLP on the nationalist side, but same-sex marriage and abortion there was no agreement within the Assembly on them. Unionists continually blocked attempts to liberalise the laws. Abortion was banned wholesale in Northern Ireland, really since the previous century. Same-sex marriage, arguments over that destabilised institutions, and you couldn't find consensus. And so what you've had is ad hoc direct rule by the UK government on sensitive issues like that. So it was the UK government that in the end introduced legislation legalising same-sex marriage and abortion because you couldn't find consensus within the Assembly. Then you've got bizarre issues that come out of the blue, arguments over a ridiculous renewable heating incentive scheme. Oh boy, with the details, but it was a classic example of misgovernance, in this case by a DUP minister. And then obviously you had Brexit and all the issues with that. Just to very quickly, I mean, if you look, the veto rights within the Assembly, here's classic veto rights being played out. Remember, the only thing you need to remember is some measures deemed contentious have to get the support of 40% of Unionists and 40% of Nationalists to get through the Assembly. If you look at the votes on same-sex marriage, by 2015, the Assembly overall was in favour of legalising same-sex marriage. But on the Unionist side, only 7.5% of Unionists voted in favour of legalising same-sex marriage. So the bill fell because it didn't have sufficiency of consensus, sufficiency of cross-community consensus. So there's an example of how Westminster had to intervene because you simply can't get agreement across the communal divide. It's just one example. In terms of Brexit, it's putting some flesh on the bones. Whichever binary you use, Protestant versus Catholic, Unionist versus Nationalist, British versus Irish, whichever identifier you want to use, you'll see big division. Overall, Northern Ireland voted to remain in the European Union. 85% of Catholics voted to remain, 88% of Nationalists voted to remain, 89% of those identifying as Irish voted to remain. You'll see on the Unionist side, there was less unanimity. Nationalists were overwhelmingly in favour of remaining in the EU. Unionists were more divided. Even 30% of DUP voters voted to remain in the European Union. But nonetheless, you know, it's still a minority take. It was still a minority view within unionism, the Protestant British Unionist community wanting to remain in the EU. That, as soon as the result came through, you knew that was going to further destabilise Northern Ireland after a period of relative stability from 2007 to 2016. You can almost trace the decline of the institutions again to that Brexit vote. And if you look at party support, you see it starkly here. So 86% of Sinn Féin supporters voted remain, 70% of DUP supporters voted to leave. And the issues that have come, the fallout from Brexit, the arguments over an Irish sea border, the arguments over the protocol, bitterly opposed by Unionists, that eventually collapsed the executive last year. The DUP walked out, claiming that until the protocol was either dropped or fundamentally reformed, they weren't going back into devolved power sharing. So again, the veto card is played. So finally, what can these regular collapses be addressed? What can be done? Well, you can change the rules of the game. You can move from a mandatory to a voluntary governing coalition. So if one party walks out, you might say, well, tough, pass on the baton to the next largest party. That in some ways is attractive. It's what Alliance argues for in the centre ground of Northern Irish politics. But of course, they would argue for that because they're the third largest party, funnily enough. So they could join the government. They could play a bigger role in government. There's obvious difficulties if you remove the largest party of unionism or if you remove the largest party of nationalism from the government. Will that make things more stable? So whilst it's attractive moving from mandatory to voluntary governing coalition, it's not necessarily a silver bullet. Or you could say, well, it's really silly, these rules where you have to designate. You don't designate as a normal human being in Northern Ireland. You have to designate as unionist, nationalist, or other if you're elected to the Northern Ireland Assembly. Get rid of them and introduce weighted majority voting, say 65% to pass a measure. That I think is that might be considered. At the moment, the Westminster Northern Ireland Affairs Committee is looking at this, and it's just possible that might be brought in. Or you end the vetoes full stop, and you just don't offer parties the opportunity to veto legislation. So in conclusion, as I said at the start, Northern Ireland, the chances of it being a stable democracy ever are pretty bleak. The stability, insofar as it exists in Northern Ireland, comes from a vastly improved security situation. And ultimately, you know, we should give thanks for that. Political institution building has failed so far. There's been modest societal thawing, but if you look at other measures of integration in terms of housing or schooling, Northern Ireland, I mean, only 9% of children, for example, as one statistic, go to integrated schools. You know, if you look overall, the dominance of the constitutional question means that transition to a truly stable democracy, given the largest party in Northern Ireland doesn't even use the term Northern Ireland, I think would be wildly optimistic. Thanks ever so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. I have some questions, but we will wait till after the next presentation. So again, if I butchered the pronunciation, don't hesitate to correct me. So our next talk is from Dr. Chiosáin, who is a lecturer at the University of Toulouse, Capitole, where she teaches legal English in the European School of Law. Her PhD from the University of Paris Sorbonne La Nouvelle was on government policy on immigration and integration in Ireland. The main focus of her research is on the reception in Ireland of asylum seekers, refugees, and migrants in recent years, where she examines the political, legal, social, and cultural changes taking place in Irish society as a result of this recent immigration. I think that was everything, and I will leave it to you.
Thank you very much, Samuel, and thank you for inviting me today. I hope my sound is okay, is it? Yeah, great. Okay, well, I'm going to share my screen. Is that good? Why don't I see this? Just a second. Okay. Okay. Right. So what I'm going to talk about today is the free movement on the island of Ireland. Where am I? No, that is not my slide. This one. Okay. So I'm going to talk about immigration and the Northern Irish border in a post-Brexit era. In my own research, I've been looking mostly at the Republic of Ireland, but increasingly now, given everything that's happened, you know, I have no choice but to start looking across the border and looking at the impact that everything, Brexit and everything, is having on both Northern Ireland and Ireland regarding migration and movement. So just before I look at it, I'm going to just give a quick run through quickly the main things that people need to know before we look at where the complications are. Okay, so I won't stay too long on these slides, but just to give a quick run through. So the first thing is that there is a common travel area between the island of Ireland, so Ireland, Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, and the island of Great Britain, the Channel Islands and the Isle of Man. So this is an agreement or an arrangement, you could probably say, because it's been very unofficial in many ways, where people can move freely. Citizens of those places can move freely around that whole area without passports, theoretically. Okay, obviously there are complications that I will mention about that in a minute. and the citizens from all of those places I mentioned have the same rights pretty much as each other in both jurisdictions. Okay, so the right to reside and work, so the Irish can reside and work freely in the UK and vice versa. Access to healthcare, social protection, social housing and education, and voting rights. Now, the voting rights aren't exactly the same. British citizens cannot vote in referenda in Ireland, but they can vote in local and parliamentary elections. So this meant that for the island of Ireland, there's always been, you know, a free, well, there's almost always been free movement around the island, and the border, particularly in recent years, has been invisible. And this has meant that other EU citizens or citizens of the European Economic Area were also pretty free to move around. Now, regarding people who are not from the EU, not from the European Economic Area in general, there were visa, and there have always been visa requirements for them, and they're not always the same in both jurisdictions. However, Ireland does tend to kind of mirror what decisions are made in the UK for different reasons, but mainly I think it's just easier, if possible, to have the same I suppose, requirements regarding visas in both jurisdictions. Okay. Now, the common travel area has existed since 1922, pretty much, when Ireland gained its independence, and it was just seemed too complicated with partition to erect a border and to try to control the border. So, but it was never in legislation, strictly speaking. So the Treaty of Amsterdam in 1997, which took effect in 1999, legally recognizes the common treaty, the common travel area. In Protocol 20, it says that Ireland and the UK would not be part of the Schengen area of open borders. The protocol also says that the two states could continue to make arrangements between themselves relating to the movement of people between their territories. Now, the Good Friday Agreement doesn't expressly refer to the common travel area. However, it is important in two respects. Firstly, the border posts were dismantled, security arrangements were removed gradually, facilitating unrestricted movement of British and Irish citizens across the border. Okay. The invisible border is probably how it's best described at the moment. We'll see how long that will last. The Good Friday Agreement does mention the special status of Irish citizens in the UK and British citizens in Ireland, regarding but there's no mention actually about, I suppose, logically, so there's no mention about the rights of other nationals. So there's a kind of I suppose, a blind spot there sometimes regarding people who are not from either British or Irish nationals. So Ireland, post-Brexit, has decided to remain part of the common travel area rather than, well, because it knows that if it joined Schengen, it would be very complicated, because then you really would need a very hard border. So there are no coming into Ireland, EU nationals coming into Ireland, there are passport checks because it's not Schengen. Okay. And up until Brexit, same thing for EU from the other EU countries going into the UK. But Irish citizens going over to the UK. There are no border checks per se, but there can be spot checks under terrorist legislation in the UK, and in Irish airports. Obviously they do check because they don't have a specific anymore. They don't have a specific common travel area channel to go to the airport. Okay. So when Brexit happened, okay, well, before Brexit happened, when the campaign before the referendum was taking place, as we all know, one of the main and most, I suppose, the thing that most focused a lot of people's attention was the idea of taking back control of our laws, of our borders, and of our sovereignty. And the borders thing was very strong in the discourse of the Brexiteers during the campaign. There was quite an strong anti-immigrant narrative in it, and the idea was increased immigration control. So in the following year, the general election, 2017, the Conservative manifesto set out the government's commitments regarding the reduction of the number of immigrants in the UK, and they said that they would bear down on immigration from outside the EU. There was a position paper on Northern Ireland by the UK at the time, not by the Conservatives, but by the government, which was a Conservative government. And they said, nevertheless, that the development, I quote, of our future immigration system will not impact on the ability to enter the UK from within the common travel area, free from routine border controls. So there is, as always, a kind of a double thing. We're closing our borders, but we're leaving them open, which is the difficulty that we will be looking at in this talk. During the Brexit negotiations, there was a lot of discussion about trying to keep the border open, to preserve the common travel area, to protect the Good Friday Agreement, and generally that it was considered that any measure restricting the free movement of Irish and British citizens within the common travel area would be incompatible or would be prejudicial to the Good Friday Agreement, since the concept of the open border is one of the three strands of the agreement, that there is movement north-south. To give you an idea of what's happening in that movement, I found this. Now, it's from 2019, 2020, but I think it's quite, it's probably pretty much the same today. Even though the situation in Northern Ireland seems the same as in the UK, in reality, the economic integration between Northern Ireland and the Republic is very high. There's a very high degree of integration, and there's a lot more border crossing. There's as you can see here, the annual movement of people north, south, south, north, 110 million, and from west to east, in other words, from the island of Ireland to GB, 24 million. The number of vehicles, 66 million going up and down, compared to 1.2 million going from Ireland to GB, okay? A lot of heavy goods vehicles as well. So you can see that there is a lot of movement there. Tourism, if you look at the tourism section of this graphic, you can see that a lot of tourists are coming. 25% of tourism going to Northern Ireland is from the Republic. So even, you know, on that level, there are a lot of people going up and down. And cross-border shopping is another thing. Depending on which which it was for a long time. When I was growing up, it was definitely Northern Ireland was cheaper. And that's where everybody traveled up to Newry to do their Christmas shopping or to buy their cheaper booze and everything like that. This continues now, okay? And you could see that people are going, there was one stage where some people were coming down, that certain things were cheaper in the Republic. So people from Northern Ireland were traveling down. But either way, there is a lot of coming and going for people doing just simply shopping trips, you know, going up for the day or whatever, or coming down for the day. Now, all of that coming and going post-Brexit, I'm sure you've all heard the you know, in the media where they talk about how complicated the whole thing is. So there are, and this number, this figure is not always absolutely, some people count others, and I will explain to you why, but the general consensus is that there are 208 crossings on the 310-mile or 499-kilometre frontier between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. Now, you can see all of these numbers. Now, what defines a crossing is interesting, and while I won't stay too long on it, I think the following photos I'm going to show you will indicate how complicated the border is. Now, there are clearly, you know, official roads that go from the north to the south or south to north that cross the border, and they are proper roads. But you also have situations like this where the border goes across a road, or, you know, kind of sometimes half of the road is in the EU, in other words, in the Republic of Ireland, and the other half in the UK. You've got even, you know, farms that are cut in half between the UK and the EU, and therefore, you know, a farmer going to one of his fields would be crossing the border, okay? You have roads where literally the border goes halfway through, okay? There have been, they've said that the border actually, counting, the border runs along the middle of 11 roads, okay? And the border meets in the middle of at least 3 bridges. So you have this very complex situation regarding border crossings, okay? Now, so the 208 crossings, you know, this kind of thing would be one of those 208. So you're not obviously going to be able to put border, you know, control any border. It would be simply impossible to police a border in any effective way physically like this, okay? Just as a comparison, when I said 208, in comparison, there are on the eastern border of the EU, like between the EU and the rest of the Eastern Europe, there are 137 crossing points. So you've got 208 in Northern Ireland, so considerably more, okay? So now this has probably nothing to do with it, but I think that it goes very well with these photographs. I found these instructions for Home Office staff from a kind of a booklet issued by the Home Office to its staff in March of 2022. Entry to the UK through Ireland, and I won't even, you can't even read it there. If somebody has a big enough screen, you may be able to read it. It just is, even without reading it, gives you an indication of just how complex everything is, who's allowed in, when, yes, no, and if yes, you know, another requirement and everything. So the whole thing is very complicated. So if you have what we call an invisible border and this kind of very complicated border that I've just shown you in the photographs, how do you police it? How do you, if you do police it, how do you do this you know, and ensure that the immigration, you know, the movement of migrants from one to the other is in some way controlled. So before Brexit, there was a thing, it still exists, but it existed before Brexit. There was a kind of a joint operation called Operation Gull, which still continues, and that is the PSNI, in other words, the Police Service of Northern Ireland, Police Scotland, the UK Border Agency, and Garda Síochána, which is the Irish police force, and GNIB, which is the Garda National Immigration Bureau, and they are they work together, okay, to try and police. My apologies, my watch. Try and police or have some kind of checks to see who's going in and out. So when it was created in 2006, the idea was it was to prevent movement of undocumented migrants across the Irish land border and sea border with on the sea border with Britain. There was this idea that Ireland was being used, the Republic of Ireland was being used as a kind of a backdoor for migrants into Great Britain. So they would come into Ireland, they'd go up to Northern Ireland and then get into the island of Great Britain via Northern Ireland. So Operation Gill basically got the British and Irish police and immigration forces working together. They had checks in and around the border, okay, with things like police and immigration officers boarding buses, searching trains that were the train from Dublin to Belfast, for example, or buses that were going across the border, coming on, sometimes stopping private cars, and questioning passengers as to their, I suppose, their immigration status or their, you know, their legitimacy for crossing the border, okay? So it's very difficult to get information about how exactly Operation Gull works, because this is not something that they share very easily for obvious reasons. But what is sure is that the operation was kind of upped a little bit in force post-Brexit, because in the past, before Brexit, it was just to make sure that nobody who was undocumented was moving across the border. Post-Brexit now, it is anybody who is not Irish or not British needs a passport or a visa to cross the border. So even French people, German people, Italians, the Polish, all of these people need to be officially, well, they want to check that these people are legitimately, you know, allowed to go across the border. Okay. So they have an issue is that if you are boarding a bus, boarding a train, how do you distinguish, because the common travel area doesn't require passports of Irish or British nationals, how do you distinguish on that bus or on that train who's legitimate if you cannot check the passports? Okay. Irish and UK citizens don't need to present a passport. Now, generally they're asked for some kind of ID, a bank card or something with a maybe photo ID. But even that is not officially obligatory. Okay. Now, when the Home Office was asked how do you do this? How do you check people's status when they're crossing the border, given the common travel area? And they said, well, and I quote, officers speak to members of the traveling public using these routes, regardless of appearance, and a consensual request for photographic ID can form part of that conversation. And they use the words very casually, conversation, because they know that they don't have the power to conduct passport checks because of the common travel area. Okay. And what is interesting is that most people crossing the border, British and Irish included, aren't aware of the fact that they're not obliged to show a passport. Okay. it does make it easier, and I think people just generally comply and show some ID to just be able to get on their way. However, one of the problems with this is when it has been noticed by a lot of people, and there are reports on this from a lot of reports by NGOs working with immigrants and human rights NGOs and things like that have done a lot of research, and there's evidence to show that there's a certain amount of racial profiling. If they get on the bus or the train, passengers have noticed that the people who get asked for ID are usually people who are Asian, people who are black, or who look Asian, look black, well, are black, and not the, you know, the red-haired, blue-eyed person sitting beside them. So the accusations of racial profiling have been there for many years, and even pre-Brexit, but they say that this is now worsening. When police in an inquiry in a report by the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission, the officers who were conducting, the immigration officers conducting these checks were asked, you know, what is the basis on which you stop somebody, and ask them, and they didn't really know, and there were very contradictory messages coming from different immigration officers. And, you know, there were some people who said, well, accent is for me, you know, an important factor in deciding if somebody is British or Irish. Or no, they didn't say that. Accent would be an important factor in determining whether someone should not be in the country, should or should not be in the country. Okay. So when these kind of things, they, you know, were put to the then border, this was in the mid 2010s, the Border and Immigration Agency Chief Inspector, Elwyn Sutter, when he was asked, you know, how do you do this? And is there not a risk of racial profiling? He said, no, he said, Operation Gull is working very successfully. And he said, well, police and immigration officers question everyone, but inevitably EU citizens, this was pre-Brexit, can quickly satisfy us. It is not terribly surprising to find that it is people who are black or of other ethnicities who are detained. So for him, a person who is black or of another ethnicity cannot be an EU citizen. Okay, which is very problematic. You know, he's conflating ethnicity with nationality, and this is kind of symptomatic of what is being found in many reports on the problem of racial profiling to a certain extent across the border. Okay, so I won't go into all the detail of that slide, but because I want to move on. But the idea is, yeah, what do Irish people or British people look like and sound like would be their kind of you know, that's where they go by. And if you look like what they think you should look like, well, then you're not checked. And if you don't, you are selected for immigration checking. Okay. So the government, obviously the UK government says no racial profiling at a border. It doesn't matter, you know, there cannot even be a hint of that going on. This was back in 2018, the Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State in the Northern Ireland and Scotland office, Lord Duncan of Springbank. Okay. So there is this problem. The next problem is the Counter-Terrorism and Border Security Act of 2019. Now, this act kind of built on what existed already in the Terrorism Act of 2000. Okay. Now, the Schedule 7 powers of the Terrorism Act of 2000 gave police powers to stop, question, search and detain people at ports, airports and along Northern Ireland's land border to see if they were terrorists or involved in any way in terrorist activity. Okay. Now, the 2019 Act expanded this, and not only to see if they were terrorists or involved in terrorist activities, was also involved in hostile activity. Okay. And hostile activity is very vague, okay? And there are concerns that given the inability to have immigration checks because of what I said of the common travel area in the previous slides I mentioned, that they're using the Border Security Act as a kind of an indirect way of immigration control, okay? So there's a part of it in Schedule 3, paragraph 2. It applies in the border strip. So this is a strip, 10 kilometers south and north of the border. And in the train stations of Newry and Portadown in Northern Ireland. So anyone in those train stations can be stopped, questioned, searched and detained without any reasonable grounds or suspicions of any offence, simply to check if they are entering or leaving Northern Ireland. Okay, so you can check somebody 10 kilometers from the border, and if you suspect that they are on their way to cross the border, you can detain them. Okay, so you can detain people 10 kilometers before they commit the offence of crossing the border if they shouldn't. Okay. And interestingly enough, in the statistics that they publish, any of the stops they have made, they have found nobody involved in terrorism or what they could say hostile activity, but they have very often handed these people over to immigration authorities. So it seems to be that they are using this as a form of immigration control. Okay. Now, in general, we have immigration enforcement checks in Northern Ireland as well as in GB. Okay. There's a much higher rate of checks in Belfast compared to London, 36 per 100,000, London 12 per 100,000, and the people being checked, Romanians, Nigerians, Chinese, Pakistani. There's also cooperation from the Irish authorities that the 2004 Immigration Act in Ireland allows border officials in Irish airports, to refuse entry to passengers with valid visas to enter the Republic of Ireland if they suspect that the person is intending to travel on to the UK. So to a certain extent, the immigration check is being subcontracted to the Irish immigration authorities. Okay. Now I will go very quickly. I'm aware that I'm running out of time. The Nationality and Borders Act of 2022 came into effect, and one of the main things, I won't go into all the details regarding immigration that was in this Borders Act, but one of the most significant ones concerning the movement over and back is that they want the electronic travel authorization, ETA, to apply to border crossing in Northern Ireland. This was something that many people during the debate of the Nationality and Borders Bill, people from Northern Ireland from both sides were actually asking not to have that for there, because they said it would be chaotic, it would be for economic reasons, for tourism reasons and everything, that putting something like that in place would not be a good idea. It would also not be a good idea in the context of the Good Friday Agreement. The Irish government opposed it. They said, we have seamless travel on the island, we want to maintain that. And again, people who work with migrants in border areas have warned that this will lead to racial profiling. This means that anybody with a non-Irish but EU passport will need an ETA to cross the border, and anybody who is non-EU EEA living in Ireland but with valid visa will need this to cross the border. Now, I will. The government said, well, no, they were asked by the House of Commons Northern Ireland Affairs Committee. They asked the government if they would be checking paperwork, and they said, absolutely not. We don't operate routine immigration controls through the common travel area. We're conscious of special circumstances, etc. However, you cannot have a law put in place and then say, well, we won't control it, because the people who are crossing that border do run the risk and cannot just say, oh, well, nothing will ever happen, because this law introduced a much stronger penalty for people found, coming into the UK without the necessary documentation. It went from 6 months you could get a 6-month sentence for this, and it was increased to 4 years. So you don't take the risk. If there is something in place, well, then it's very complicated for people not to do it. So this is very complicated for people living in Ireland, for the simple reason that geographically, sometimes if you're traveling from one part of the Republic to another part of the Republic, you kind of cross through Northern Ireland. If you're going from Dublin to Donegal, for example, you go through Northern Ireland. This is no longer going to be possible for people who are not Irish or British citizens, not automatically possible for them to do this. There were some examples of people who are, for example, asylum seekers living up in Donegal in reception centres there, and whenever they need to go for an interview to the offices in Dublin, they have to take a really long way around, because if they cross into Northern Ireland and they get caught, then their asylum application would be withdrawn because they would have committed a criminal offence, those kind of things. Then you have very basic fundamental frontier workers, people who cross the border a lot, migrant workers, particularly working in the health service, things like that. So that's getting extremely complicated. So I will stop there because I've gone over time, and there are other things, but maybe they will come up in the discussion. Okay, thank you for that.
Thank you both. Thank you both for very interesting talks. I know that Sonia has a question in the chat, so maybe I will start with that, and then I'll open it up to the floor. If people have questions, I'll let you ask them. So Sonia's question, because she has microphone problems, was after the Good Friday Agreement, and I believe this is for both of you. After the Good Friday Agreement, Northern Ireland seemed like a model of successful peace building and conflict transformation. What went wrong? Today, is it possible for Northern Ireland to move closest to sustainable peace and a stable democracy?
Unmute myself. Okay, yeah, it's a good question, Sonia. I don't think it's a case of what's gone wrong in terms of the successful peace building, because peace, the Good Friday Agreement has delivered peace, notwithstanding sporadic dissident Republican and loyalist paramilitary activity. And yes, there is still in particular loyalist paramilitary control of communities, but only the ultimate in naysaying would deny the success of the Good Friday Agreement as a peace deal. As a political deal, I would readily concede that it has not achieved conflict transformation. It is again, that consociational approach to which there may have been no alternative, which was to freeze the conflict and make sure that the conflict was played out in a political arena or arenas, that is the Northern Ireland Executive and Assembly, where you literally had in the early days people who had tried to kill each other, sharing parliamentary institutions. So it was always ambitious to expect peace, love and reconciliation, or harmony, I should say, within those political institutions. I think what's been disappointing is that there's never been a programme of reintegration of Northern Irish society. Now, that's partly because some people don't really believe in Northern Ireland as an entity, and would argue, look, the biggest barrier to that is that dividing line, that border. We just heard about the significance of borders. That border on the island of Ireland. Ultimately, you're only going to get full societal integration when you get rid of partition. That would be a Republican argument. People in the centre, like Alliance, would argue the way to societal transformation is you've got to have a much more proactive programme of integration. So you need to provide those integrated schools. You need to have shared housing. But that's easier said than done. The Northern Ireland Executive has, as one example, tried to build shared housing estates, but what has happened is that people have been put out of those estates for being from the wrong community or the wrong religion. So there are limits to public programs of reintegration. I don't think sufficient effort has been made. If you look at public opinion surveys, it shows that a majority want integrated education. The big test will be if there is ever an equal playing field for integrated education, and there has been a bill passed by the Assembly and Executive to have integrated, would parental take-up be at the level of faith schools? We should also get away from the fact as well that you know, some of these measures that are supposed to achieve societal transformation, are they really tackling the problem? I mean, you know, in England, people send their children to faith schools, but there's not a sectarian problem. It's the constitutional divide ultimately in Northern Ireland that remains the issue of perhaps the most acute polarization.
Could I perhaps ask a question, Samuel?
Yes, of course, go ahead.
For Jonathan, I was wondering what you think of the impact of Brexit on the political system in Northern Ireland, and do you think it seemed at first that Brexit was going to make matters worse and just increase the cleavages and between the unionists and the nationalists? Is that proving to be the case, or?
Yeah, I mean, Brexit definitely made things worse. The only semi-stable period of devolved power sharing that we've had in Northern Ireland was 2007 to 2016, where you had a pragmatic working relationship between the DUP and Sinn Féin at the head of that administration. It wasn't perfect, and there were hiccups, but it didn't collapse, you know, which is success on some measures. And then came the Brexit vote. And I don't think for 1 minute that the DUP, which was the only sizable party that campaigned in favour of Brexit, I don't think for one moment they thought there would be a vote in favour of Brexit, because I don't think they knew what to do after that. I mean, I remember, you know, I go to all the party conferences in Northern Ireland in the line of work, and I went to the DUP's conference that autumn after the June Brexit vote, and Brexit wasn't mentioned. It was like this sort of, you know, let's not mention Brexit, because I don't think they thought through the implications in terms of a border, given that whatever the differences, and they've been huge in recent years between the UK and Irish governments, both sides agree that the border on the island of Ireland has to be kept soft for obvious reasons, notwithstanding what we just heard in terms of the illogicality of some British government positions that we just heard from Bairbre. So I don't think the DUP thought it through. The logic of that, they said, I mean, the logic of DUP opposition to the EU changed over the years. When Ian Paisley was leader, it was a religious objection that the EU was this, to quote him, you know, this great Catholic conspiracy, which was a problem undetected by any other political party anywhere in Europe, it should be said. But then it became an issue of sovereignty for the DUP, and the DUP's line was that the EU had treated David Cameron, the UK Prime Minister at the time, with contempt in the Cameron's attempt to renegotiate the deals, the terms of Britain's place in the EU, and therefore the DUP would campaign for a leave vote. They'd not thought it through, and then of course they were sold out by Boris Johnson, who I remember turning up at the DUP conference, the first known case of a British political leader turning up at someone else's party conference to launch his leadership bid for the Conservative Party. And became leader within a year, promising the DUP that no British Conservative Prime Minister, I'm quoting exactly here, no British Conservative Prime Minister could or should sign up to an arrangement that put a border in the Irish Sea. Okay? What did Boris Johnson do the following year with the Taoiseach Leo Varadkar? He signed up to exactly such an arrangement and then signed it with the EU. So there's a sense of terrible betrayal within the DUP. Quite what they want is unclear. They've got these 7 tests at the moment for the protocol, one of which says there cannot be a border in the Irish Sea, but clearly there will be a border in the Irish Sea for goods going Great Britain to Northern Ireland and onwards into the EU single market, because the EU will defend the integrity of its single market. The DUP could dress up a deal. If there's no checks on goods going Great Britain to Northern Ireland, they could say, well, we protected the integrity of the UK internal market. And that's, I think, where there may be sufficient grounds for a deal that will restore devolved power sharing. But Brexit was destabilizing. Within 6 months, well, but yeah, 6 months later, the institutions collapsed, and they've never been, other than temporarily restored. They were restored for 2 years on a very unstable basis, from 2020 to 2022. You can almost trace the recent difficulties of the institutions back to that Brexit vote.
Right. Thanks.
Yes, I would like to first thank you for two fascinating papers. There are many questions. I was kind of wondering about the common travel area. The reason why the Irish authorities would have agreed to carry out checks as to people who might be seeking to enter Great Britain via Northern Ireland. Is that did they agree to that because they you know, this is an attempt to preserve free travel in the British Isles, which is important, obviously, or were there other arguments? And do you have any idea of the number of people who might have been identified as planning to go to Great Britain? Sorry, we don't hear you.
Can't hear you. We can't hear you, Bairbre. You need to put your microphone. Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, well, there are a few questions there. I'll try and answer them in order. There's very little communication from the Irish authorities over such matters because it's not something that they are particularly, you know, public about. It's very difficult to get statistics on how many people they actually stop, but there have been records, and you know, I don't have specific records, but there have been reports written where people do get stopped and turned back at Dublin Airport, even with valid papers for the Republic of Ireland, because they believe that they're going up north. And it seems absolutely incredible. And I think that if those people appealed those decisions into courts, I think they would collapse very quickly. But very often these are people who, well, they may not know what those rights are, and they go back to wherever.
Turn back, they're put on a plane back to where they came from.
They can be put back to where they came from, or they can be detained, and then they, I don't know what they do, you know, in true Irish fashion, probably kind of, you know, detained and then let go and kind of just disappear, please, you know, those kind of things. But there is a very serious attempt that, you know, kind of, they say, look, this is the only way. I think, as you say, it's the only way to make the whole island of Ireland thing work, is that they're not seen to be facilitating this kind of loophole, as it's seen as this kind of a weak link in the border of the UK, which would be Northern Ireland. So yeah, I don't know if you had, I think you had another question, and I can't remember what it was.
Neither can I, but your answer was quite satisfactory. Thank you.
Very difficult to get, just to summarize, very difficult to get information on what exactly they're to what extent they do this, and in what context, you know, what are their grounds for, you know, I mean, once or twice, you know, there were kind of there's anecdotal evidence about things like, well, you know, they told us that, you know, the address they were going to was, you know, and they gave an address which was in Northern Ireland. They kind of betrayed themselves, you know, and therefore they had proof. But there have been occasions where, with no proof, they just say, you know, are you sure you're not going north? No, but they said, we have reason to believe. So, yeah.
Karine, you have a question?
Yes, hi, thank you, Bairbre and John, for your two papers. I have a question, for 3 questions, I should say, for John, about when you talk about addressing the systemic issues and ending the vetoes possibly, or changing the nature of the coalition and so on. I was wondering how that can be done and who by. when the assembly is not sitting, when there's no executive? Is it up to the NIO or to the British government? And also, once things are, if those changes were to take place, were to be decided, should there be another referendum? Because it would change the nature of the GFA. And I was reading this morning or yesterday that if there was a new vote on the GFA, the majority of the unionist community would vote against it. So, you know, all those questions.
Yeah, great questions. In terms of who can change the rules, basically it's the UK government can change the rules in liaison, one assumes, with the Irish government, and the rules have been changed in the past. The part of the difficulty, part of the logjam is that realistically, at least the leading parties would have to agree the change in rules. And I don't see the DUP and Sinn Féin, or Sinn Féin and the DUP, to put them in the correct order these days, being that keen on changing the rules when they are the parties that can wield the vetoes. They wouldn't have a vested interest in changing the rules. Sinn Féin and the DUP did change the rules back in what was rather grandly termed the St Andrews Agreement of 2006. So the DUP thought that they would be the largest party in Northern Ireland in perpetuity, and they changed the rules so that previously the first and deputy first minister in this mandatory coalition had to be elected on the basis of a cross-community vote within the assembly. That was changed so the largest party would automatically be able to nominate the first minister from there on. So the DUP thought, this is great, we'll change the rules to this. And Ian Paisley, the DUP leader at the time, would be first minister of Northern Ireland, and Sinn Féin would provide the deputy first minister. The powers are equal, but the symbolic importance of being called first minister is quite important, and the DUP quite like that. So the rules were changed, and there was no referendum for that. It was to some extent a DUP Sinn Féin stitch up in 2006 with the approval of the UK government, because it did produce for a number of years after relatively stable devolved power sharing. So in terms of changing the rules, Sinn Féin and the DUP are not that keen on changing the rules at the moment. The DUP don't want to move now from a mandatory to a voluntary coalition because they're not in the assembly at the moment. They're the ones who are staying out. If you said, well, we'll just bypass the DUP and we'll move to the next largest party alliance, the DUP are out of the game. Their veto has gone. So the DUP aren't going to support change at the moment. The government has indicated that it will review the rules of the Good Friday Agreement, and the Northern Ireland Affairs Select Committee has it's asked for evidence as to how the rules should be changed. But I don't think there's consensus over what rules should be changed. Personally, I'd get rid of the communal designations and just go to weighted majority voting within the assembly rather than everyone having to designate as unionist, nationalist, or the rather reductionist other. Whether Northern Ireland's ready for that yet is a moot point. In terms of support for the institutions, yeah, you highlight a really important point. Remember, only a bare majority of Protestants voted in favour of the Good Friday Agreement in the referendum of 1998. Only 57% of Protestants voted in favour of it. So there was always only a bare unionist majority. That support fell by 2002 to 1/3. And if you believe the poll that was published in the Belfast Telegraph last Monday, only a minority of unionists say that they would vote in favour of the Good Friday Agreement if there was a vote again tomorrow. So that's alarming. Yes, there's still overall majority support for the agreement. It's not down that much. 71% support in 1998, 64% would vote in favour of the referendum tomorrow. But really, it does need the support of both communities if it's going to thrive. And that's disturbing, the fact that you've now got only minority unionist support for the deal.
Thank you.
Are there any more questions?
Actually, I have a follow-up question. What do you make of that, the third community, the neither?
Yeah, I mean, well, they excite me because we're publishing a book on Alliance later this year, so I've been shamelessly plugging it at every opportunity. So I think they matter, and they've been overlooked. But if you look at consecutive Northern Ireland Life and Times surveys now, you know, it's a big proportion of the population that says we're neither unionist nor nationalist. It's the largest sector people tend to think of Northern Ireland as unionist versus nationalist, but actually, according to surveys, the largest section of the population is those who say, well, I'm neither a unionist nor a nationalist, but that's not reflected in voting terms because unionists and nationalists are sufficiently exercised politically to go and vote, whereas the neithers, they're not that bothered. Alliance has grown in recent years, representing the political centre. I suspect they'll continue to grow. It's partly a Brexit thing. It's partly the fact that they're fishing in that big electoral reservoir of those who say they're neither unionist nor nationalist. But Alliance can't change the rules themselves, and that's the difficulty. They're a centre party, but they're just simply classed as others, and the system, or the assembly and executive, are really set up on the basis of unionism versus nationalism. So where they go, I don't know, but basically they are trying to overcome unionism and nationalism, but they are neutral on their constitutional future. And I think a difficulty for Alliance, the centre ground, will be what would happen if a border poll was called? Could the party take a position on whether they supported United Ireland or Northern Ireland in the UK? I don't think the party could. I think it would split the party. And so they say, look, you know, we shouldn't have our politics defined by constitutional questions. That's why we won't take a position. But many people would say, critics of that would say, well, surely you need to decide who you want to govern your country.
Thank you.
So if no one else has a question, I have a couple of questions for well, actually, I have questions for both of you, but my first question is about asylum and sort of refugees in Northern Ireland and Ireland. Do people tend to apply for asylum more in Ireland or in Northern Ireland? And is there a sort of a reason why they prefer them? And another question, which is just, if people refuse to show photo ID, what happens in that situation? If they believe someone is, or whatever the situation, what is the sort of the next step?
Okay, regarding asylum seekers, historically, asylum seekers used to go to the UK, but more to England. Not so many to Northern Ireland. So the majority on the island of Ireland, definitely a lot more people in Ireland, in the Republic of Ireland. There was for quite a long time, bad and all as it was, there was a better reception situation for asylum seekers. They were, you know, they were put in these direct provision centres, which everybody agrees, you know, are not satisfactory, but they were looked after to a certain extent, a little bit better than in the north. And I think that there were some problems in the north with hostility. You know, 20 years, if you're talking 20 years ago, I think a lot of them felt that it wasn't a kind of a good place to go and ask for apply for asylum. Nowadays, I would say that people would, if they're going to apply for asylum, they would choose to go to the Republic of Ireland because of the UK's now, you know, how would you say it, tightening up of, you know, of the whole asylum situation, where there is a risk that if they apply for asylum, they may find themselves in Rwanda in some camp, or, you know, or in danger of, as that comes online. Yeah, there are more of them in the Republic, definitely, and there seems to be a tendency. On the other hand, if you talk, that's for asylum seekers. If you're looking at international protection applicants in general, now it's anecdotal, because there have been very, very many Ukrainians who arrived in Ireland in the last year, over 60,000 and counting. Which is a lot proportionate to the population. But there have been instances of Ukrainians who came to Ireland and then who travelled to Northern Ireland to get to Britain, you know, maybe to join family or for other reasons. So there are some incidences of people going up, but in general, no, I would say majority in the Republic rather than Northern Ireland. And oh yeah, your second question about what happens if somebody, I think there are some people who, you know, make the point of refusing to show. However, and if those, well, the problem is the people who get asked to show their ID are very often Black or, you know, visibly different. And those people know that if they refuse to show some form of ID, that they can be detained until such time as they can verify that they do have the right. Okay. There was the case of a Black Irish woman who was on the bus, and she said, I don't have to show you my ID. I don't have to show you my passport. And they said, okay. And, you know, and she testified in this kind of committee, and she said that she ended up showing them her bank card just to, you know, to get on. The whole bus is stopped. There's a lot of tension, and, you know, you are not exactly very comfortable. The other people who, you know, there have been people from some of the NGOs who've tried to go on the buses and tried to kind of get, you know, a la Rosa Parks, you know, get stopped and refuse, but they're never stopped because they're white. They're never stopped and questioned and asked for their ID. So it's very hard to know what happens apart from, yes, detention if they have reason, you know, to suspect that you may not have papers, or you may not be Irish or British national.
Okay, thank you. So actually, and seeing the time, I think we will stop there because it's 11:30. So and we're right on time. So thank you everyone for being here. Thank you to both of you for your very interesting presentations, which the recordings of which will be put on the website in the next few days. So you'll be able to watch it again if you missed the beginning, or if you want to see certain parts again. And we will send out an email well, before the next session, which is in March. But yeah, thank you again, everyone, for being here, and have a wonderful day.
Pleasure. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you very much indeed to both presenters. It was really nice, very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.